Step away. This is between us.
Found it in his jacket pocket, ma'am.
$4 million. Found exactly where we expected.
That stone isn't from your necklace.
A cook is going to lecture me about my own diamonds?
Have it verified. You'll want that on record.
After that, Lena will be in child services by morning.
I know.
While 200 guests waited upstairs, Camille Sterling made her move. A planted stone appeared exactly where she needed it. A man stood still while someone reached into his jacket. She watched it all with the calm of a woman who had done this before, who had chosen her target carefully, a single father with too much to lose and too little power to fight back. What she missed was the moment he glanced at his watch when she named his daughter. Not in fear, in confirmation. What did Camille Sterling not know about the man she just arrested? If you've ever watched someone get treated as guilty before anyone asked a single question, day with this story. And if you're new here, subscribing takes 1 second, and it means you won't miss what happens next. The night Camille Sterling made her move, there were 200 people in that house who did not know Gideon Price's name. They knew the food. They knew the 7-course service ran without a single delay. They knew that whatever the Sterling household paid their head chef, the result was worth it. But they did not know the man standing behind the kitchen door, watching the clock on his wrist, and waiting for a woman to finish destroying herself. To understand why Gideon stood still when they put handcuffs on him, why he did not flinch, did not argue, did not explain, you have to go back 3 months to the morning. He walked through those service entrance doors for the very first time. He woke before 5 every day. Not because the job required it, though it did. Because Lena's hair took 20 minutes to braid properly, and she needed a hot breakfast before the school bus came. And her homework from the night before needed a second set of eyes before she packed her bag. Gideon had learned in the years since Lauren died that a child's sense of safety is built out of small, repeatable things. The same voice saying, "Good morning," the same pair of hands checking the same backpack zipper. He could not give Lena her mother back, but he could be there every single morning without exception, and he was. He had spent 17 years building a different kind of discipline before that. Federal work had a rhythm too, but it was cold and unpredictable, built around evidence chains and informant contacts and courtrooms where the wrong word at the wrong moment could collapse a case 3 years in the making. Gideon had been good at it, better than good. The unit that handled art theft and jewelry fraud and transnational insurance schemes was not a large one, and the agents who lasted in it were the ones who could sit with information quietly, who did not need to act on everything they knew the moment they knew it. Gideon had that quality in abundance. What he had not had during those 17 years was enough of what Lena needed. When Lauren's diagnosis came, and then when Lauren was gone, the gap between what his career demanded and what his daughter required became something he could no longer negotiate around. He submitted his resignation on a Tuesday. By Thursday, he had enrolled in a professional culinary program. The transition made sense to almost no one who knew him. To Gideon, it was the only logical next step. The Sterling estate sat on a property that occupied more land than most people would see in a lifetime, tucked behind a gate in Greenwich that did not announce itself. Graham Sterling had built his investment firm across 3 decades of careful, relentless accumulation, and the house reflected that, not flashy, but overwhelming, in the way that real old money tends to be overwhelming. He hosted frequently politicians, museum directors, hedge fund partners, the kind of collectors who referred to their acquisitions by artist and year without needing to explain either. He needed a chef who could execute at that level without requiring supervision, and someone had given him Gideon's name. The interview lasted 40 minutes. Graham offered the position before Gideon reached his car. Camille Sterling did not attend the interview. Gideon met her on his third day. She walked through the kitchen during afternoon prep, dressed as though she was heading somewhere important, and looked at him the way people sometimes look at furniture they did not choose for themselves. She said in a tone that was almost pleasant that her husband tended to make hiring decisions based on appearances rather than qualifications, and that she hoped Gideon understood the standards her household maintained. She was smiling when she said it. She left before he could respond, which was he understood the point. By the end of his first week, she had referred to him in front of the household staff as the image hire had made a comment about checking the silver after his shifts, and had asked him twice casually, conversationally, what exactly he had done before culinary school, because she found it unusual that a man his age would make such an abrupt career change. Gideon answered none of those questions directly. He needed the job. More than that, he needed it to be stable. The kind of employment that didn't end on short notice, that came with reliable hours and reliable pay, and the assurance that Lena's school year would not be interrupted by another move. He had learned long before he ever worked a federal case that the most dangerous thing you could do in a hostile environment was let the other person know what you valued. So he let Camille's comments land without reaction, and he went back to his cutting board, and he made the dinner that left Graham's guests asking where the chef had trained. The rest of the staff had a different read on Gideon almost immediately. He remembered that the woman who handled the household laundry took her coffee without sugar, that the younger man on security had a daughter starting high school in the fall, that the housekeeper who had worked for the Sterlings for 9 years always looked slightly relieved when someone remembered to save her a plate from the late shift. Gideon noticed these things the same way he had once noticed the details in evidence reports, not as performance, but because people's lives were the most interesting thing in any room. Paige Sterling noticed him in return. Graham's daughter was in her late 20s, working nominally in her mother's charitable foundation, and she spent enough time at the estate to observe how the household actually functioned beneath its polished surface. She saw Gideon step out to the service corridor every evening around 6:30, the same time every day, and call the same number. She heard enough of those conversations, not eavesdropping, simply present, to understand that he was checking whether Lena had eaten dinner, reminding her to lock the front door, asking about a math problem that had been giving her trouble. There was a quality to his voice during those calls that was different from every other hour of his workday. Quieter, more careful. Like a man who understood that the most important responsibility he had was also the one most beyond his control. Then Camille announced that her sapphire ring was missing. She did it in front of everyone. The full household staff assembled in the main corridor on a Wednesday morning, which alone told Gideon this was not accidental. The ring was worth $30,000. She wanted Gideon to empty his jacket pockets immediately, and she wanted the food container he had prepared to bring home to Lena that evening opened and inspected on the spot. He did both without comment. The ring was not there. Camille maintained pleasantly that she distinctly recalled seeing Gideon near the hallway adjacent to her bedroom the previous afternoon. No one confirmed this. No one contradicted it either. The ring turned up 3 hours later in the second drawer of Camille's own vanity table. The housekeeper who found it reported it quietly. Camille received the information, said something about things being moved without her knowledge, and that was the end of it. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just the clear and deliberate decision to move forward as though the incident had not occurred. The silk scarf came a week later. This time, Camille called the police. Gideon agreed to have his personal bag checked. He was precise about what he was agreeing to: his bag, the contents visible inside it, nothing further without a warrant. The officer who took the call was a young man who had responded to a dozen petty theft complaints and expected this to proceed like all the others. The language Gideon used to describe the limits of a consensual search was not the language of someone guessing. The officer noted it. So did Camille, who was watching from the far end of the hallway, with an expression that had shifted almost imperceptibly from expectation into something more calculating. The scarf was not found. The officer left. Camille told Gideon later, standing close enough that no one else could hear, that men with too many secrets never lasted long in her house. That night, Lena had fallen asleep on the couch, waiting for him. Her backpack was on the floor, one strap still looped around her wrist from when she'd been sitting up. On the cushion beside her was a worksheet from her English class, an open response assignment with the prompt printed at the top, "Who makes you feel the safest?" She had filled the entire page. Gideon read it standing in the dark living room with his coat still on, and when he finished, he went to the closet shelf and brought down the locked box he had not opened in over 2 years. Inside, a digital recorder no larger than a pen, a secondary phone running encrypted software, and a federal badge that no longer had any legal authority, but that Gideon had never been able to throw away. He set all 3 items on the kitchen table and looked at them for a long time. Then he began keeping records, every instruction Camille gave regarding the household, every camera blind spot Victor Rains had walked him past on his first security orientation, every shift schedule anomaly, every moment that felt designed rather than accidental. 3 weeks before the gala, the Cartier necklace arrived. Camille wore it to dinner twice. It was a piece of the kind that required insurance documentation, 47 diamonds, white and canary yellow, assessed at $4 million by an independent appraiser. The insurance policy had been issued through a private firm that catered exclusively to clients at a certain wealth level, the kind of firm that processed claims based on declared value and serial number without requiring secondary verification at the time of submission. Gideon recognized the structure immediately. He had spent years learning how those policies worked from the other direction, watching the people who exploited them. What he understood, looking at where Camille chose to store the necklace, not in the main bedroom safe, not in the vault, but in a secondary case Victor had installed in the service corridor, directly outside the kitchen, was that the previous incidents had been rehearsals. This was the production. Victor adjusted the corridor camera angle 2 days before the event. The security patrol rotation changed the following morning. Miles Hargrove, who had worked asset recovery for the same federal unit as Gideon, and still did, called him that afternoon and told him to take Lena and leave Greenwich before the weekend. Gideon listened to the whole argument. Miles was not wrong about the risk. If Camille had already filed the insurance claim, and Gideon believed she had because the policy structure made it possible and the timeline made it logical, then everything that happened at the gala was a formality. The stone would be found in his possession. The altered footage would place him at the scene. The staff who liked him would be useless against the word of a woman whose lawyers billed more per hour than most of them earned in a month. And then there was Lena, the disruption, the look on her face when she learned the people who were supposed to protect families had decided her father was dangerous. He sent Miles a copy of every file he had compiled. He mounted a small camera on the interior of his car's windshield, angled toward the service gate. He verified that the auto-upload protocol would run continuously to an external server that Miles could access independently. Then he went home, cooked dinner, helped Lena with the geometry problem she'd been stuck on since Tuesday, and sat on the edge of her bed after she fell asleep. In the morning before he left for the estate, he wrote Miles's number on a card and slid it under Lena's phone case where she would find it if she went looking. He told her at breakfast that if he wasn't home by midnight, she should call that number immediately and stay on the line until someone came. Lena looked at him with the particular stillness children acquire when they understand an adult is telling them something serious while trying to make it sound manageable. She asked him if he was going to be in danger. Gideon set down his coffee and looked at her, the braids he had done that morning, the backpack strap over one shoulder, the worksheet she had left on the counter from the night before with the prompt still visible at the top. He thought about every family Camille had done this to before, the ones he knew about, the ones he didn't know about yet. "I'm trying to make sure a bad person can't do this to any other family," he said. Then he drove to Greenwich, walked through the service entrance, and started cooking. The gala ran the way Gideon had intended it to run. 7 courses, 200 guests, not a single plate sent back. From inside the kitchen, he could hear the particular register of a room where everything was going well, the overlapping conversations, the laughter that came a beat after someone clever said something, the sound of glasses being refilled without being asked. He had cooked in that kitchen for 3 months, and he understood its rhythms the way he had once understood the rhythms of a surveillance operation. The gaps, the handoffs, the moments when attention moved elsewhere. He kept his team moving, kept the timing tight, and did not allow himself to think about Lena until the last dessert course had gone out. Camille had worn the Cartier necklace into the dining room at 8 o'clock, 47 diamonds under the chandelier light. She had made certain to stand near enough to the guests who would remember what she was wearing, the way people with expensive things sometimes engineer their own witnesses. Around 11:30, she excused herself to go upstairs. When she returned to the main floor 14 minutes later, the necklace was gone, and a smaller piece had taken its place at her throat. The substitution was clean. Most people in the room would not have noticed. Gideon, watching through the kitchen pass-through, noticed. The scream came from the second floor shortly after midnight. It carried the practiced quality of something that had been prepared rather than something that had simply happened high at the start, then controlled, then dissolving into the kind of distress that reads well in a crowded room. Camille appeared at the top of the staircase and descended slowly, which gave everyone time to look at her before she said a word. When she reached the bottom, she turned directly toward the kitchen corridor and pointed at Gideon by name. She told the room she had seen him leaving the dressing area on the second floor. She said the necklace, the Cartier, the $4 million piece she had been wearing all evening, had been taken from the vanity while she was downstairs. Victor Raines appeared within 2 minutes with a tablet displaying what he described as the security log for the evening, a time-stamped record showing Gideon on the second-floor hallway at 11:41. Graham Sterling stood near the fireplace with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man trying to decide which version of events required less from him. He did not speak. 2 of Victor's security staff moved to either side of Gideon and walked him toward the back corridor off the kitchen, away from the guests, away from anyone who was not already on Victor's payroll. In the back corridor, Victor asked Gideon to remove his chef's coat. Gideon said clearly that he was not consenting to a search of his person, and that any evidence obtained without his consent would be challenged. Victor proceeded anyway, reaching into the right exterior pocket of the coat, and removed a small velvet pouch. Inside the pouch was a yellow stone, the same rough carat weight as one of the canary diamonds from the Cartier setting. Victor held it up under the corridor light, as though presenting it to an audience, even though the only people present were himself and his 2 security employees. That arrangement was not accidental. Camille had constructed this moment for a room with no independent witnesses. She entered the corridor after the area was secured. The performance from the staircase was finished, and she did not bother to maintain it. Her voice when she spoke was the voice Gideon had heard her use when she fired the housekeeper 7 weeks earlier. Flat administrative, already past the emotional part. She told him that by morning he would be in a holding cell, that Lena would be placed with Child Protective Services before he made bail, and that no one would take the word of a man like him against the word of a family like hers. Then she stepped forward and struck him across the face open-handed in front of Victor and his two guards, 3 men she was certain would stay silent. Gideon did not move. He did not reach for her, did not raise his voice, did not give her the image she needed to complete the story she was building. The anger was there. He felt it the way you feel a current in water present real capable of force. But he had spent 17 years learning the difference between what you feel and what you do. And he understood that a single uncontrolled reaction would hand Camille something no amount of evidence could take back. On his wrist, the watch vibrated once. The upload was complete. Detective Nadine Cross arrived within 20 minutes of the call. She was methodical in the way that experienced investigators tend to be, not slow but deliberate reading the room before she committed to anything. Based on Victor's documentation, the velvet pouch, and Camille's statement, she placed Gideon under arrest and walked him through the main hall to the front entrance. The guests who remained watched him pass. Several of them were holding phones. The image of a man in a chef's coat being led out of a billionaire's gala in handcuffs traveled across 3 social media platforms before the police car reached the end of the Sterling driveway. By the time Gideon arrived at the station, the story had been shared several hundred times. Before the booking process began, Gideon looked back toward the house and found Paige Sterling standing near the entrance watching. He asked her as clearly as he could manage to find Lena before Lena found the news on her own. At the station, Gideon invoked his right to remain silent, requested an attorney, and declined the secondary search. Detective Cross proposed. The precision of those 3 steps, the correct legal framing, the absence of emotional protest, the specific language around search consent made. Cross set down her pen. She had processed several hundred arrests over her career. She knew the difference between someone who had been coached and someone who had spent years in rooms where that language was the native dialect. She ran his background check herself. The federal record came back in under 10 minutes. 17 years. Transnational art and jewelry fraud insurance crime coordination with Interpol across 4 jurisdictions. Commendations. Case closures. An expertise in synthetic stones and insurance policy exploitation that the report described with bureaucratic understatement as exceptional. Cross read it twice. Then she went back into the interview room and sat down across from a man who had allowed himself to be publicly arrested, handcuffed, and photographed, rather than identify himself as someone who had spent nearly 2 decades putting people like Camille Sterling in federal prison. Across town, Lena had woken up around 1 in the morning and found the apartment quiet in the wrong way. She checked her phone and saw the images within 30 seconds of opening the first app. She called Gideon's number 4 times. Then she took the card from under her phone case and called Miles Hargrove, who was already in his car. When Cross asked Gideon why he had not disclosed his background, the moment Camille began targeting him, he answered without elaboration. If Camille had known she was maneuvering against a former federal agent, she would have stopped before committing the acts that made this a prosecutable case. He needed her to complete the plan, to file the false report, to plant the stone to submit the fraudulent insurance claim, to direct Victor to alter the security footage. He needed her to build the case against herself so thoroughly that no lawyer could dismantle it in a courtroom. Then he provided Cross with 4 items. The first was an audio recording, captured on the device he had been carrying since the week Camille threatened him in the hallway after the scarf incident. In it, her voice was clear and unhurried. She had selected Gideon specifically because a single father working a service job would lack the financial resources and social standing to mount a credible defense. The second was footage from the camera mounted in his car which showed Victor Raines carrying a lockbox through the service gate the previous afternoon before the necklace was reported missing. The third was a lab result Cross was able to request. Within the hour, the yellow stone found in Gideon's pocket was a high-quality synthetic, not a natural diamond, inconsistent with the Cartier setting it was claimed to have fallen from. The fourth was a timestamp from the insurance company's own filing system, confirming that a loss claim on the Cartier necklace had been submitted and accepted into processing 2 hours before the first guest arrived at the Sterling estate that evening. The firm's client services manager confirmed that their VIP policy structure allowed claims to be initiated by serial number declaration without requiring same-day verification, a gap that had never been flagged because no client at that tier had ever been investigated for exploiting it. By 4 in the morning, Gideon was no longer a suspect. He was a witness and, at Cross's request, an informal consultant on how to proceed. The FBI arrived at the Sterling estate before 8. The search warrant covered the main house, the service structures, and 2 storage properties registered to Victor Raines's security company. The Cartier necklace was recovered from a climate-controlled unit Victor had leased under a subsidiary name, packed in its original case, alongside a prepaid phone, a quantity of cash, and a text thread that documented every step of the plan from the night Camille first described Gideon as the right kind of target. Victor was taken into custody before noon. Facing federal charges with no viable defense, he began cooperating before his attorney arrived, and as part of that cooperation, he directed investigators to his 2 security employees who had been present in the back corridor the night of the gala. Those 2 men, no longer bound by loyalty to an employer who was now facing prison, confirmed under oath that Camille had struck Gideon and that he had not responded physically. Their testimony became part of the federal record. Camille was arrested in the main hall of the estate. The same hallway, the same marble floor, the same space where Gideon had been walked out in handcuffs 8 hours earlier. She did not go quietly, but she went. What came next, however, was not over. Through her legal team and through relationships she had cultivated for years with certain journalists who had attended her charitable events, Camille began a secondary campaign. Gideon was described in several outlets as an unstable former operative who had conducted illegal surveillance against a private family and engineered his own arrest as the opening act in a scheme to extract a civil settlement. Her attorneys filed a request with Child Protective Services arguing that a man who had deployed surveillance equipment in a private household and who had left his 11-year-old daughter home alone on the night of a high-stakes operation was not a suitable primary caregiver. The request worked temporarily. Gideon was released cleared of the original charges and told he could not bring Lena home until the welfare assessment was completed. He met her in a supervised room at a county family services office, a beige space with a round table and a window that looked into a parking lot. Lena sat across from him in the chair she had pulled as close to his as the caseworker permitted, and she asked him in the direct way she had inherited from him whether they were going to take her away permanently. He told her they were not. He told her he was going to bring her home. When she was walked back to the temporary placement and the door closed between them, Gideon sat in that beige room alone, and for the first time since this had begun, lost the composure he had held through the arrest, through the interrogation room, through Camille's hand across his face. He cried in a way that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with a father sitting in a government office, temporarily separated from his child by a woman who had studied his vulnerability and aimed at it precisely. The investigation that followed confirmed what Gideon had suspected. 2 previous incidents. A household manager who had been charged with stealing an emerald brooch 3 years earlier and had accepted a plea agreement rather than risk a trial that could have cost her far more than the verdict. A laundry worker named Dennis, who had spent 4 months in pretrial detention after being accused of taking a sapphire bracelet, whose conviction had followed him for years. Both of them had young children. Camille had not chosen victims who were weak. She had chosen victims who had something to protect people for whom an arrest was not just a legal problem, but a threat to the families they were holding together on their own. Gideon understood that he was not only fighting to bring Lana home, he was fighting for the families Camille had already broken. The federal trial began 6 weeks later. Camille's legal team had assembled the kind of defense that serious money buys 3 attorneys with long trial records, a strategy that did not dispute the physical evidence but redirected the jury's attention toward the man who had collected it. They argued that Gideon had used illegal surveillance methods against a private family, that the entire sequence of events had been engineered by a man with the training to engineer it for the purpose of financial gain. They introduced the detail of Lena being left home alone during the gala not as incidental background, but as a characterization. What kind of father, they suggested, places his child in a position of vulnerability in service of a personal agenda? The question landed in the courtroom on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by Camille's lead attorney in a tone that was careful and calibrated to leave a mark. He asked Gideon directly whether he had used his daughter's circumstances to generate sympathy that would influence the jury. The room went quiet. Gideon looked across the courtroom at Lena, who was sitting beside Miles in the gallery, wearing the same backpack she had worn to school that morning because Miles had picked her up directly from the building. He took exactly the amount of time he needed. "My daughter is not evidence," he said. "She is the reason I gave up the badge. She is the reason I didn't fight back when your client hit me. And she is the reason I am not going to allow your client to do this to one more family." The prosecutor then requested permission to play the audio recording. The recording in which Camille Sterling, in her own voice in her own hallway, explained that she had chosen a single father, working a service job, because a man in that position would accept a plea deal rather than risk losing his child. The jury heard it twice. The defense team did not request a third playing. The jury went into deliberation on a Friday afternoon. Gideon spent the first hour in the hallway outside the courtroom, seated on a wooden bench, with his hands resting on his knees, and Lena sat beside him, with her shoulder pressed against his arm. She had been returned to him 3 days earlier after the Child Protective Services assessment concluded that the welfare concern filed by Camille's attorneys had no evidentiary basis and had been initiated in bad faith. The caseworker who closed the file had used that phrase specifically, bad faith, and had apologized to Gideon in a way that suggested she understood the apology was not sufficient. He had thanked her anyway. What mattered was that Lena had slept in her own bed for 3 consecutive nights, and that when he braided her hair that morning, she had talked about a project her science class was starting, not about court dates or lawyers, or whether families could be taken apart by people with enough money to try. Lena asked him while they waited if he thought they would win. Gideon told her he thought the jury had heard enough to make the right decision. He believed that. He also knew that believing something and being certain of it were different things, and that the difference between those two states was where most of his fear had lived for the past several weeks. He did not say that part. He put his arm around her instead, and she leaned into him, and they sat together in the hallway, while other people moved past them on their way to other rooms with other problems. The jury returned after 4 hours and 20 minutes. The foreperson read each count in the same measured tone, the kind of voice that gives nothing away until the last syllable. Conspiracy. Guilty. Insurance fraud. Guilty. Federal wire fraud. Guilty. Filing a false report. Guilty. Obstruction of justice. Guilty. Fabrication of evidence. Guilty. When the final count was read, Gideon felt Lena's hand tighten around his fingers from the gallery where she sat with Miles. The judge confirmed the verdict, thanked the jury, and set a sentencing date. Camille Sterling sat at the defense table and did not turn around. The sentencing came 5 weeks later. 13 years in federal prison. Full restitution to Gideon, to the household manager, who had accepted a plea deal rather than face proceedings that could have cost her far more than the verdict, and to Dennis, the laundry worker, whose conviction had followed him for years and whose family had lived with the weight of it. The court's written findings included a specific designation that Camille had selected her targets based on economic vulnerability and single-parent status, and that this pattern constituted an aggravating factor in the sentencing calculation. The day the sentence was handed down, the child welfare investigation was formally closed and the record sealed. There was no ceremony to mark it. A caseworker sent an email. Gideon read it at the kitchen table in Stamford while Lena was at school, and he sat there for a while without doing anything else. Graham Sterling had already begun dismantling his life in Greenwich by then. He came to Gideon in person, not through an attorney, not through a written statement, but directly at the apartment in Stamford. Graham stood in the doorway and said that he had seen signs for years, not all of them, but enough. He had told himself that Camille's behavior towards staff was a matter of personality, of the particular anxiety that came with maintaining a certain kind of household. He had told himself that the incidents with the ring and the scarf were misunderstandings. He had chosen each time the interpretation that required the least from him, and that choice had given Camille the space to continue. The people she had harmed had paid the price for his convenience. He said this to Gideon without qualification and without asking for a response. Gideon gave him one anyway. He told Graham that what he did next mattered more than the apology, and that the people who had been hurt needed something more durable than remorse. Graham took that seriously. He filed for divorce before Camille's sentencing. He sold the Greenwich estate. From the proceeds, he established a legal defense fund specifically designed to serve domestic and service workers facing criminal accusations from employers, with a secondary provision for single parents who needed representation in custody or welfare proceedings triggered by those accusations. Victor Raines received a sentence of 4 years after his cooperation agreement was finalized, and the security firm he operated lost its state license on the grounds that it had conducted unlawful searches, tampered with surveillance evidence, and facilitated the false imprisonment of an individual in its custody. The household manager and Dennis both had their convictions vacated within 2 months of the trial. Both received restitution under the court's order. Dennis told the reporter who covered the story that the money was not the point, though he was grateful for it. The point was that his child had grown up believing her father had stolen something. Now she would know he hadn't. That was the thing Camille had taken, that no amount of money could fully return, but the truth was at least something to stand on. Paige Sterling did not make a statement to the press. She contacted Gideon through Miles and asked whether he would object to her volunteering with the legal fund her father had established. He told Miles to tell her that the fund's administrators made those decisions, not him, but that he had no objection personally. She began working with the organization 3 months later, handling intake interviews for workers who had been accused by their employers. She visited Lena occasionally, not often enough to become a fixture, but enough that Lena knew her name and seemed glad to see her. Gideon turned down most of the interview requests. The ones he accepted were the ones where he could redirect the conversation toward the people who had come before him, toward Rosa, toward Dennis, toward the ones who had not had 17 years of federal training to fall back on when Camille aimed her machinery at them. He was uncomfortable with the version of this story that centered on his professional background, on the quiet competence of a former agent who had outmaneuvered a wealthy woman on her own ground. That story was satisfying in the way that certain stories are satisfying, but it left out the part that mattered most, that he had only survived this because of what he knew, and that most people in his position would not have known it. Lauren's table opened the following spring in a narrow building on a side street in Lower Manhattan. The name was painted in plain letters above the door, no flourish, no explanation. People who came in for the first time sometimes asked about it, and whoever was working the host station would say that Lauren was the owner's wife, and that she had died some years ago, and that the restaurant was dedicated to her. The space was small, 12 tables, an open kitchen, a counter along the east wall where Lena did her homework on weekday afternoons, while the dinner prep ran behind her. The staff had been assembled with particular care, single parents, people rebuilding after wrongful convictions, culinary students from programs that served communities the industry tended to overlook. The work was real and the expectations were high, and the people who worked there understood both of those things without needing them explained. On the wall behind the pass-through, visible from most of the dining room, there was a framed photograph of Gideon in a dark suit, standing in what appeared to be a government corridor. The federal badge was visible at his hip. He had placed it toward one edge of the wall, not centered, not lit, not labeled. What was centered at eye level, mounted in a plain wooden frame, was a handwritten page from a school assignment. The prompt was printed at the top in the institutional font of a homework worksheet, "Who makes you feel the safest?" The page beneath it was filled in a child's careful handwriting, the letters slightly uneven, the margins ignored. One night after the last table had cleared and the kitchen crew had gone home, Lena looked up from her book and asked him why he hadn't simply told Camille who he was, why he had walked into that house for 3 months, absorbed everything she threw at him, and never once said, "I know exactly what you're doing, and I have spent 17 years putting people like you away." Gideon wiped down the counter and thought about how to answer in a way that was true without being complicated. He told her that people who intend to do harm tend to be careful when they know they're being watched. Camille had been running the same scheme for years, precisely because she understood how to read a room, how to stop before crossing a line that would hold in court. If she had known what Gideon was, she would have found someone else, someone with less to protect themselves with, and she would have started over. Lena considered that. And then she asked what would have happened if he hadn't had the recordings, if Miles hadn't been reachable, if the insurance company's system hadn't preserved the timestamp. What would have happened to a man in exactly his position who didn't have any of those things? Gideon set down the cloth he had been using and looked at his daughter, the homework spread across the counter, the book face down beside her cup, the frame on the wall with her own handwriting inside it. He thought about Dennis's child growing up for years with the wrong story about her father. He thought about Rosa unable to work in the only field she knew because of a record she hadn't earned. He thought about every version of this story that ended without a recording, without a timestamp, without someone who knew which questions to ask. "That's why it only means something," he said, "if the next person doesn't have to fight it alone." He turned off the kitchen lights. Lena packed her book into her bag, and Gideon held the door while she walked out ahead of him into the evening. He locked up behind them both, and they went home. Gideon Price did not win because he used to carry a badge. He won because when someone tried to use his love for his daughter against him, he refused to become the man she needed him to be. He stayed calm when they humiliated him. He stayed present when they tried to take everything. And when it was over, the first thing he did was make sure the people who had fought the same battle without his advantages would not be forgotten. There are people in this world who choose their targets carefully, not because those targets are weak, but because they have something precious to protect. A child, a family, a life built quietly and with great difficulty. And the cruelty of that calculation is that love, the very thing that makes a person fight hardest, is also the thing that makes them most vulnerable. What Gideon showed is that it does not have to stay that way. Patience, evidence, and the refusal to become what someone else accuses you of being. These are not small things. They are the difference between a story that ends in a courtroom and one that ends in a life. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. The people who fight quietly, who hold it together for their kids. When everything is falling apart, they deserve to be seen. That is what this channel is here for. Subscribe, and we will keep telling these stories together.